Eric Schmidt, I want to thank you very much for doing this. You and I have known each other now for about 10 years. One of my worst presentations ever was when I sat down in front of you. I hate to admit this, but you got to remember it. It's about maybe 10, 12 years ago. And after 3 or 4 minutes, you said to me, if you don't have anything more valuable, then we're going to end this now. And I about died. And it taught me the flexibility of getting to the point, of watching your audience very carefully. And I'm grateful that in the end, you gave me well over an hour and you and I got to know each other. So the first thing I'd ask you is, I'm a language guy, and we got about 100 people on this call right now. And I know we're starting before a couple of people come on, but I've been trying to find a nonpartisan, non-ideological approach to how we open up the government. And I want to ask you what you think of this language. A science-based approach we want, the restrictions we need, and the freedom we deserve. Are those the attributes? Are those that work for Eric Schmidt?
They are. And by the way, in that original meeting, I took notes and I've kept them to this day in my briefcase. That's how valuable our first meeting was. And it really helped me. So I think where we are is we bungled the first a month or two of this crisis. We could have seen this all coming. But now where we are is we've got to balance the risks of health and balance the risks of reopening the economy. And I think we can mathematically solve to a situation where most people can have most of the freedoms and most of the economic access that they want, and we can get mostly the same level of good health that we've had before. There are groups for which this is not true. So, for example, the elderly will still be in trouble until there's a vaccine. The danger to them is too great. And people who work in very crowded conditions, which cannot be socially distant, well, we're going to have to work on that. But what we do know is that if you wear N95 masks that are fresh and new and clean, and you follow appropriate social distancing, the odds collectively of you all getting sick are quite low.
So where do you go? You're a truth teller and you're a truth seeker. I watch everything I can on cable, and frankly, there's very little that I can watch. I try to read everything, and what I read is not great. Where do you go specifically for the truth that the people listening can also join you?
Well, the truth is that for the first month, I spent my time watching television. And for the next month, I have specifically not watched any of the shows. The reason is that I don't find there's no added value to the dialogue. Everyone's positions is now fairly well set. What I'm looking for is what's the insight of the next step. And here's what I think. I think that we can solve this problem if we rely on modeling and numbers and mathematics that tell us where the trade-off of risks are. If I were a governor, I have to make an important decision. Do I open a golf course? By the way, the answer is yes. And a school, and the answer is maybe, maybe not. If I'm running a university, I've got to make a decision whether I can reopen in the fall or not. We can help model those decisions and let the decision maker make a better decision. I just haven't seen that. And what I'm particularly disappointed about is one of the geniuses of America is we have the state system, and the decisions here are properly at the governor level. Where does every governor have a scientific advisory team? Every governor, every state has a fantastic university full of technical people who can advise them on making these trade-offs. And I'm including doctors, obviously, in this.
So where else are we going wrong? And this is not meant as a political question. And I'm going to avoid that strictly in this.
Yes. Yeah. In fact,
what expertise are we not using?
Well, what I would, if I could just be broadly critical, both parties have disappointed in this because both parties went to their traditional bogeyman rather than facing the fact that we had a war that was doubling every 3 days in front of us. And they didn't say, let's throw away the partisanship and let's figure out a plan of 500 things which will stop this wave. That didn't happen. People have died as a result of that. Now, having said that, we managed to pass almost $4 trillion worth of stimulus, which is largely to keep the economy in some level of health. But what we didn't do is we didn't fund a relatively small number of billions of dollars to work on vaccines and antivirals at the level that is needed. So just at the point when expertise could have helped every governor and the federal government, we didn't go to them. We went to constituencies that were in pain rather than people who could help us understand. And we're trying to remediate this now. In a war, what you would do is try to have a Manhattan Project to end the problem. And in our case, for example, there's lots of evidence that if we do aggressive social distancing and aggressive mask wearing, plus a few other changes, we can bring the R naught, as it's called, which is an exponential spread, down to something where it becomes an annoyance for most people, not necessarily for the elderly, but for an awful lot of people. And having said that, we had enormous success with the healthcare providers who managed to stave off the potential overburdening. What we should be doing now is figuring out what the math is for opening up each sector and how quickly can we do it. It should be a series of stages. In that sense, the first, second, and third stages of the president's plan are not unreasonable, but there's no science behind it. There's no way to make the decision. These are life and death decisions. I want to know if I open up a school, how many more people will get infected? If we open the polls, how many more people will infected? And let me finish by saying that we've also been unclear on what the problem is. The problem is not you and me and the other people on this phone. The problem is super spreader locations. Individually and collectively, there isn't that much disease among us, but collectively, when we all show up on the subways, we spread it very quickly because this thing is so catchable. And so this trying to understand what the super spreader hotspots are and figuring out how to mitigate those things is the next challenge.
So there are at least two governors on this call, and we've got some people from Washington, members of Congress and senators. What's your evaluation right now? And I'll let you move into this if you want to, but you can reject it also. Dr. Fauci, Dr. Blix, the people who are around, the scientists, the medical professionals, people who are around Donald Trump, are they the right people for this challenge?
I don't think it's up for me to make that recommendation. The people that I've seen who've been giving medical advice have been giving good medical advice. So to me, the problem is not that the scientists and the medical people aren't wrong. The problem is that the process and the way our governance is working is not listening. We could have, for example, addressed this in a very different way. We could have done a national shutdown for 14 days and then take the people who are then sick and treat them as best we can. And in 28 days, in 2 cycles, we would have largely eliminated the disease. But we didn't consider that alternative because it's very painful. So now where we are is we've got to until we have herd immunity or a vaccine, we're going to have to adjust our daily lives and our business to the presence of this thing. There's a great risk of reinfection in the fall. If you look at the history of the pandemic in 1918, there was a first cycle in October, which was well discussed in historians. They opened up the polls for a week in November, which had tragic results. There was then a huge spike in deaths in January and then a subsequent peak later. It's really, really important that we understand the modeling of the spread and what we need to do it. More money in those areas, and then collectively, it's an organizational problem. Each governor should have a scientific and medical advisory group which pounds against this to say, yes, governor, open up golf courses, which, by the way, are typically not a problem, and don't open up bars. And the hardest problem, if I may suggest, is going to be the question of schools, in particular K through 12 schools, because the children who are unlikely to themselves be very sick, there's a possibility that they will infect their parents and teachers and so forth, and there's no way to isolate them and keep them separate. If you look in Denmark, for example, they've just announced they're opening schools with a 2-meter separation requirement for each kid. Try doing that with your first graders.
So right now, polling as of the last 24 hours, even if the U.S. opens up in 2 weeks, only 25% would resume normal activity. 70% would stay at home except for doing necessary shopping. That tells me that the American people are actually on board with where we stand. That sounds like a pretty smart response. Any
Yeah,
comment about them?
yeah, you want to distinguish between your self-interest and the interest of the community as a whole. So I have a number of friends who have decided they're not going to get this disease no matter what. They haven't left their homes. They live in nice houses. They have plenty of money. They check everyone who comes in and out. They've completely self-isolated for 6 weeks. That is not possible for the vast majority of Americans. But what I can assure you is, one, they're bored to death, and two, that's their choice. They're completely self-isolated. My opinion is that as the country opens up, the cohorts that are able to move, in particular young adults and even normal sort of age adults, will start to commingle, but they'll do so in a safe manner. I trust the American people will do the right thing here. And we have this weird phenomena in America where we always want to judge what other people do. I'm really happy that each governor is making their own decision about this, because each state is different. And the decisions that North Dakota and South Dakota make are highly unlikely to affect me personally. And we need that laboratory innovation, and we need the numbers to prove it. I'll give you another example. In Europe, Sweden, Germany, and France all have very different models of how they're doing this. My personal opinion is that the German model, which is somewhat more relaxed than ours, is probably the best one for America. But now we're beginning to get data as to how severe the lockdown has to be. We need the data in order to make informed decisions. We're flying blind. It's as though this disease is being done to us. We're not controlling it, it's controlling us.
So I got to ask you about the African American population, because they've been hit worse. It's not just they live in urban areas. There's a higher percentage in those urban areas. We know that there is inequality in health services. We know that they're more likely to live in smaller spaces. And frankly, we're going to have to address the issue whether they followed or did not follow guidelines. But what can we do now and going forward? Because it's decimating the African American community.
Well, first place, we have a huge problem with the underclass minority folks in our country, economic injustice, healthcare issues, and so forth. People are more likely to get very sick if, for example, they're overweight or they have other comorbidities. Interestingly, not asthma. So if you look at the demographics here, some of the groups that you're describing have an excess of that relative to the majority population. We need to address that. But right now, what we need to do is get people some guidance that's stable, right? That doesn't change every day on the whim of the president or the governor or so forth. And roughly that guidance is that you'll be fine if you observe social distancing, you're wearing masks, and you try to avoid these crowded spaces. The people who deny this are hurting people, because they don't seem to understand that if you get this, you can spread it to 3 or 4 people, one of whom can be a loved one, especially an elderly one, and they can actually die. So you as an individual do have a responsibility for your own behavior. What I've been trying to do is sit outside, do my work, because I know that if you're outside, you're 19 times less likely to get the disease than if you're inside. And by the way, we have another moral responsibility, which is this is a global pandemic that touches every human being. As an aside, this is the first time in history since the invention of farming that every human being has faced the same problem at the same time. When this disease begins to predominate in the barrios and slums and incredibly dense places, especially in Africa, it will be a horrendous human activity, and it's arriving there.
I want to get you to say something one more time, because it's a big deal. If we're sitting outside, we're doing our work outside. Of course, you got to be in a community where it's warm enough. What is the percentage difference between being outside and inside and getting this disease?
It's not a percentage; it's 19 times.
That's incredible.
So, people keep saying it looks like the disease abates in the summer. There's lots of evidence that the disease is not temperature sensitive itself, but you are. And so, frankly, with your family, tell your kids, just go outside, run around, right? Enjoy yourself, get healthy, take a run, go for a walk, what have you. And I think right now, the first thing the governor is going to be opening up are parks, community activities that are outside. Stay outside. And by the way, spend the whole summer outside. In fact, you should probably open up the construction jobs that are outside. How about having restaurants that have outside seating? How about the restaurants open up which are outside? So again, this is not that complicated, and a proper modeling would show you this. Figure out a way to change the air conditioning in buildings so that they have more fresh air. Just a list like that. But basically, if you get sick from this disease, you'll get it from an aerosol or from droplets, which you get from coughs and so forth and so on. And wash your hands obsessively, 20 seconds obsessively. You put all that together, you'll get through this okay.
I hope the Trump administration reached out to you. I hope the governors are reaching out to you. I got more to go, but that's incredible. If you can look to the future, what I've always been impressed is that you don't see things as they are, you see them as they will be. It's the great Bobby Kennedy line. What is the new normal 12 months from now? Are shopping malls going to reopen? Are they ever going to come back? Are we going to lose our main streets? How are we going to live 12 to 24 months from now?
So I think in 5 years, things will be quite different, but it's hard to predict. I think for the next 1 to 2 years, society is going to be changed in some pretty profound ways. One of the most interesting things is that trust is going to become more important. I'm going to be much more comfortable at a dinner party with people that I know than people I don't know. This notion of trust and who I am and how I spend my time and how I evaluate my own risk is going to be crucial. And I think people will naturally and internally do that. The areas that are going to be hardest hit are the travel sector, the hotel sector, the business travel sector, because frankly, in the digital world that has emerged, though much of that stuff is not as necessary. And more importantly, on balance, why would you take the risk? You might as well get in your car and go to the beach nearby, which is a great place, and it meets all the tests that I just described. So we need to find a way to help our hotel people and so forth. One of my ideas is, we're going to need a core of people to keep things clean, right? Think about the subways. Again, using the subways, which is a very hard problem. Why not have the equivalent of a CCC, as we did in the 1930s, whose job, with masks and appropriate sanitation and so forth, is to keep everything disease-free? That would give an opportunity for employment for people whose jobs have been perhaps irrevocably taken away from them, and people who want to work, right, and who are good servants of our society. There's all sorts of ways of doing this, but I think we have to recognize that the analog world, right, the sort of retail and optionality is going to be suppressed for a while. I'm very, very worried about the bankruptcy cycle, because I think the bankruptcy essentially eliminates capital out of the system. The banks have done a very good job of keeping the economy going. Fantastic job by the Fed and all the banks and so forth. And compare that to previous times. They knew what they were doing this time. But still, these businesses depend on cash flow. They're over-levered. And it's going to be more than a month or two before those businesses come back. We're going to have to deal with this. I should also mention, and not to toot my own horn of my industry, but the tech industry is going to do just fine here, no surprise. As people move more online, things which we had hoped would change toward technology are going to happen much faster. One of my doctor's friends said that he'd been working for 10 years to try to get the billing for telehealth to be the same as normal doctor visits, and in 1 month it became the same price. So if you think about it, it makes much more sense for you to do telehealth if you can. It's more efficient for you. The doctor gets the same amount of money, and it's safer for both of you. So I think that those changes are probably going to be profound and permanent.
Now, you just mentioned the issue of risk, and I apologize. I know that there's a little feedback, but you're consulting the government over AI, you're consulting the government over technology, you serve on the Pentagon Commission on AI. What about the risk to our infrastructure, our technological infrastructure? If we could get hit this hard on health and economics, are we vulnerable on cybersecurity? Are we vulnerable on AI?
We are, and indeed, I'm a member of a commission, and I head a commission called the National Security Commission for AI. There's good news and bad news. The good news is that America is the undisputed leader in these technology areas. It is a source of enormous innovation, enormous job creation, and enormous wealth creation. You notice that the stock market is doing really well compared to the situation around us. Much of that is because the top most valuable stocks are in the tech sector. So the tech sector is more than just a bunch of tech people and a bunch of tech solutions. It's also an economic engine in our country. The bad news is that China has figured all this out, and they're coming fast, and they're very smart. As part of our public report, which we recently released, we think that the Chinese are perhaps one generation behind, and one generation is not 10 years, it's like 1 to 2 years. And they're heavily invested in AI, quantum, and many of the things which are where America has historically been great. What we need to do is we need to focus on building out those sectors, which means more money, more investment, more economics, more startups, more of all the things that we're really good at. The other thing we need to do, and some people don't like to hear this, is we need to allow the super smart immigrants to come into this country to work on these projects. Would you rather have the AI expert be in China and create a company in China, or would you rather have them be in the United States and create a company in the United States? Seems like a pretty straightforward decision. Bring them into, and I'm not talking about general immigration, that's a separate conversation. I'm talking about the specific people who can create enormous competitive advantage for our nation. And this is true in national security. With respect to the infrastructure, our infrastructure is pretty good, but our opponents are getting pretty good too. And if you look at the Russian manipulation, which has been well documented, it's not done. We're getting better and better, but we need a lot more focus on that.
I'm curious, would you be afraid of online voting, and do you endorse it?
I am not a fan of online voting. I'm a fan of digital voting. And the difference is, the problem with online voting is it's just too easy if it's purely online for the systems. People make mistakes, there are bugs and so forth. I'm in favor of essentially a combination of physical voting and mail-in ballots. In other words, a physical component. In other words, you have to go in place or you have to do something physical. And that physical is your backup. That allows you to count. If you go pure online with no physical backup whatsoever, I think it's too easy for people to, shall we say, change the outcome, especially if they're the foreign power.
I got another balancing question from one of the people who's on this call. Google and Apple are developing a technology similar to what's used in Israel. And it allows you to track the people you've met. So if you get sick,
Right.
they can then approach the 6 or 10 or 12 people you've been near. I don't know if we'll allow that technology in America because we believe in personal freedom and we would have a problem with the government knowing that information. What's the right balance between personal freedom and health and safety?
Well, can I just argue that Apple and Google in this particular case got the balance right? One of the things that people miss is that the algorithm is designed so that nothing about you is maintained in the system. So should you be exposed to somebody else, it won't tell you who and it won't tell you where, but it will tell you that you were exposed and you should go get checked. So they did a clever thing where they used Bluetooth low energy, and they literally forget who they are every hour and so forth and so on. So it's essentially untrackable. So the people who are crazy about privacy, who are sort of they're over concerned about privacy in my view, can be assured that this is fine. I think the reality about all of these things is it's a balance of interests. And from my perspective, I would like to know if I have been exposed to someone, and even if it was just a heads up saying, Eric, you need to go get tested again. And obviously, the best way to deal with our crisis is to have more testing because we're fighting an invisible enemy. You've got somebody shooting you and you can't see the bullets. You've got somebody bombing you and you can't see the missiles. It's crazy. So imagine a scenario where we had reasonably frequent testing. Some of the proposals are every week, every 2 weeks of most Americans. You would very quickly be able to identify hotspots and put them out.
Okay, I've got 3 more questions, 1 from me, 2 more from others, but I'm at the limit. Can I get 9 more minutes of your time, please?
Of course.
Some of this is coming from Fox News, and it's the idea that you have to carry with you some sort of ID card that proves that you're virus-free. Now, we can do this via technology, that if you get a test, we can send you the information, but there are others who say that this too violates personal privacy. I really need to explore this because I've had several people on the right who are nervous and uncomfortable. And I know that the average person wants to know that the individual standing next to them is safe.
Yeah.
How do we strike that technological balance to be able to prove that you are safe? You can be admitted to a building or a ballpark.
So this is a fantastic question. And let me explain that China has answered this question in a different way. In China, there's a mandatory app which has a green, yellow, and red. The green means you're safe. The yellow means we're not sure, but we think you're iffy. And the red means don't go. They are using it to quarantine people to their buildings. I cannot imagine that that kind of an app would be acceptable in America. So a fallback from that is essentially a digital passport that you would carry in your phone that would say, a doctor has certified that you were checked with an appropriate test and the test was negative. Here's the problem with that. There are problems with the accuracy of the tests and there are problems with the timing of the tests. If I showed up and I had this from a week ago, how safe am I? Seriously, Frank, you'd say, well, maybe you saw somebody yesterday. And remember that the way the disease works is you get exposed, and these are all averages. In the first 3 days, you have no symptoms and you're not dangerous. For the next 2 days, you have no symptoms and you're most dangerous to others. It appears that this disease, which is a particularly cunning and bad one, is most dangerous to people when you yourself do not know you're giving them the disease, and nobody wants to give anybody this disease. So there are limits to these passports, and I think that the answer will be a balance of risks. So here's an example. How often do you have to have this thing updated? I don't know. Will people be comfortable carrying their phone around all the time? What happens if there's fraud and so forth and so on? I don't think we have enough experience to know. I do think that a result of lacking this sort of a solution, people are going to be unlikely to want to get on airplanes because the airplanes are so contained. They're going to want to unlikely to go to very closed spaces. And so until we can solve this problem one way or the other, with either a digital passport or some other way of increasing global domestic trust, we're in trouble.
Okay, I don't know how you're going to do with this one. Is China, you began that answer with talking about the Chinese system. Is China a competitor? Is China an opponent? Is China an enemy?
So I have a strong opinion that China is not today an enemy, and they are a strong competitor. And I think if one way to think about it is, we're going to have a lot of China bashing in the next year or two for many reasons, which are all the political groups agree. I'm not going to take a position on that. But the fact of the matter is that when this disease originated in China, they were just as vulnerable as we were. They addressed it as aggressively as they could in a way that we wouldn't. And it showed that they put their humanity ahead of their economy. We have shown that we put our humanity ahead of our economy. We're more common than we want to believe. We're competitors today. And in that competitor, here's what I would like to do. I just want us to win, us being America. For every single interaction with China, I want us to say, how do we win? I don't want to say, how do they lose? I want to say, how do we win? So an example is, I want us to get their best Chinese students, and I want them to ship them to us, and I want us to keep them, because that's how we win and they lose. That's competition. If they are a true opponent in a war sense, I think it's going to be very bad, because the danger of miscalculation. Remember that in this recovery, the Chinese will recover more quickly than America. We're a service economy, they're a manufacturing economy. They've also been earlier in the cycle. So at least for a while here, China's going to look stronger than we are. And that will lead to, again, strategic miscalculations. It's very important that we not get into a World War I situation where a series of small events lead to a terrible conflagration. China is both important and a competitor and dangerous at the same time.
I've got students from Bourbon Day, the private boys' school, on this call. I've got a few students from NYU Abu Dhabi, and you'd be proud of them because
Good.
They're continuing to study. They're not wasting their time. They're not playing video games. They're actually learning. And they have been screaming at me for the last half hour. They're losing their internships. They're losing their job offers. It's already late April. What advice do you have for them?
Well, look, America was built with immigrants, and these people, they show up, they pay taxes, they create businesses, and they stay. This new sort of prejudice against immigrants is really a mistake. We are built on this. Furthermore, we have a competitor in the form of China that has 4 or 5 times more people, depending on what numbers you're using, which part of the economy. How do you want to compete with them? You need partners, and in particular, you need these incredible minds. I live in a world where talent is not the same. Every person is not the same. You have these crazy, insane people who invent the future. I want all of them in America, right? Including the ones from Abu Dhabi, right? And I'm sorry, the Abu Dhabians would prefer to keep them in there, but I want them in America. And I want to have closer relationships between Abu Dhabi and America for that reason. I don't understand why this is so simple. If you look, 50% of the tech companies in Silicon Valley were founded by immigrants.
Wow. Well, I will invite you when everything opens up. You've got a reason to be in the Middle East. I'll put a dozen kids in the room.
Good.
That will be the next Googles and Facebooks and YouTubes and Ubers and all of that. Final question, and I'm grateful you stayed a little longer. My favorite quote of yours, and I am reading it because I'm not going to get it wrong. Countries that have the internet already are not going to turn it off. And so the power of freedom and the power of ideas will spread, and it will change those societies in a very dramatic way. That's as hopeful and as optimistic as you can be. Well, you have given me tremendous hope in this interview. Over the last 90 days, knowing how quick this can spread, knowing where our economy, not just in America, but in Europe, in Asia, are really going to have some tough times. Are you as optimistic now as you were when you said that quote a few years ago?
I am, for the following reason. I believe in America, and I believe in the American dream and American freedom. And I know you and I completely agree on this. And I suspect all of our listeners do as well. There's something very special about America. Everybody wants to come here. You don't want to go to these other countries. You want to come here. Let's make us exceptional in the American exceptionalism that we've always had. We should be able, as a result of this pandemic, to become the arsenal of democracy for tools against this pandemic. We should be able to organize ourselves with our math systems and our modeling and our tools and our new masks and our new drugs and so forth, that we can help everybody else. That's the best of America. There's every reason to think that all of that is in front of us. I mean, we were doing really well before this pandemic hit. All those incredible people are still here in the country. They're still just waiting for this to end. So let's get through this as fast as we can and get back with the mission of making the world a better place under American values and with American democratic principles.
And I'm going to give you the last word. What do you want? Because I'm looking at some of the comments. You've got a former White House chief of staff who's listening to you right now. Got an Academy Award-winning actor who I know doesn't matter as much as the former chief of staff. But Eric, maybe I didn't ask you something, or maybe I asked you something wrong. What do you want people to know from this interview?
I would like to see a plan right now for national unity around defeating the war against the disease and getting back to being great as an American. I think it's achievable. I think it just requires everybody to calm down, get some facts in front of themselves, and get on with the business. I think it can be done fairly quickly. We're going to have some problems, in particular in the industries that I described. The quicker we can get things restarted safely, the less damage will be done permanently. I do think that the world in the future will be a bit more based on trust, a bit more digital. This is obviously in my self-interest, and I don't think it's bad. It will also be more efficient. And what I hope is that we also understand that this is a good reminder that we're all human beings. All those Chinese people, they got sick too. All those Russian people, they got sick too. So let's remember that we are united by our common humanity.
Eric, I trust it's the strongest compliment I can give you. There's very few people I trust. I trust you. I want you to have and take the biggest role that you possibly can. I love your work for the Pentagon. You and I have a friend in common who's doing cybersecurity. He tells me, whatever you say, listen to it. So I thank you for this. I apologize for your team for letting you off 12 minutes late, but thank you for doing this.
It's a privilege to do this, Frank. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to seeing all of you soon. And Frank, I'll see you very soon.
You got it. Everybody, thank you very much. Call is done. Bye-bye.